First of all, welcome everyone. My name is Zandvliet, and on behalf of the Responsible Mining Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on harmful impacts of mining and how to normalize prevention. We're very glad you found the time to attend the webinar. We have had over 730 registrations, which is an indication that this topic is of keen interest to a lot of people. And as you will have known by now, the webinar follows the publication of the report on harmful impacts of mining by the Responsible Mining Foundation. It came out 2 days ago. If you're still looking for it, you can find a copy on the website of the foundation. So for today, we have a great panel with whom we explore the question about harmful impacts and really what to do about it. We have panelists who provide insights from an industry perspective, a union perspective, civil society perspective, multi-stakeholder perspective, and also from a company perspective. So that will make for hopefully a really interesting discussion. And just to put the elephant on the table, elephant in the room on the table, and it's about the topic of today, harmful impacts of mining. It's proven to be a bit of a title that is catching people's attention. And just even before the session this morning, I got some messages from friends who said this is not the right title. We cannot talk about something that is so negative, and it's the wrong focus. But at the same time, we talk about impacts all the time, right? We have social impact assessments, we have human rights impact assessments, we have environmental ones, we have health impact assessments. So in fact, you wouldn't be able to start a mining project these days without having an assessment of potential impacts and to discuss the mitigation options. And in addition, I'm based in Canada. If you talk about relations with local communities here, you talk about impact benefit agreements, and that is still the language that's used, and it's seen as good practice. So it's kind of interesting that we have accepted the notion, and I think that that mining operations have negative impacts as well as positive ones, can have positive ones. And the issue is really that when these impacts become harmful, then we need to call a spade, and that's what we're doing today. So that's that's the background for the discussion. What was really interesting in preparing for this session, that I wanted to know a little bit more about the organizations, where the different panelists came from, and what was really interesting is that the purpose of the various organizations are all using very similar language, varying from respecting human rights, labor rights, ensuring safe, fair, and sustainable mining industry, ensuring the health of individuals, communities, ecosystems. So we have a lot of common ground and in what we are saying publicly. And that's an interesting given, because in many ways, we're kind of all in it together, right? And that makes the discussion today an interesting one, because the harmful impacts report clearly signals that we still have a long way to go. And especially when it concerns impacts identified in the report, that by and large focus on impacts that we should be able to prevent, right? Because after all, we do know by now what it takes to respect human rights, including labor rights. We do know how to address environmental impacts. And we even know that relations with communities are highly predictable, right? Rather than this black box that nobody feels is in control of the company. So why is getting it right so difficult? And I would like to, and maybe there's 6 questions to kind of, that may be feeding the discussion a little bit. The first question is, it's not that we only see that risk management amongst companies is inconsistently applied, which is a key finding of the report. But I would even argue that impact management, so risk to people, risk to the environment, is even more poorly implemented, right? For example, how many sites actually track and measure the status and the effectiveness of the mitigation measures that they committed to in their ESIA or the Human Rights Impact Assessment that are part of the regulatory framework? Second, how many regulatory bodies do actually follow up with companies to verify that these impact mitigation measures are actually implemented? Third, what about incentives? If we are serious about mitigating harmful impacts, how will we incentivize desired behavior and, more importantly, desired outcomes of that behavior? Fourth, from a governance perspective, do we need to have more corporate oversight to minimize the risk that the relative independence of most sites lead to harmful impact or may lead to harmful impacts. Fifth, that's linked to the question about that frequently comes up in terms of more regulatory oversight rather than corporate oversight, especially to address the impacts of the companies that are not at the table today, right? Because the subset was only looking at the larger companies, but there are a lot of companies out there that are much smaller and do not subscribe to the same standards that the larger companies subscribe to. And then the sixth question I was thinking about is about corporate culture, because it's not that impacts are typically not known, right? It's the information doesn't always get the right attention at the right level. And to give you an example, when I was thinking about it, it's still interesting that we refer within companies to some departments as support departments. So the human resources function, labor rights, the security function, the environmental department, the community relations department, we're still seeing them and framing them as support functions to the operational process or the operations process. So that means effectively when we talk about impacts and we sit around the table to make decisions, that some voices are more equal than others. And that's something that maybe we need to ponder. So that's kind of to put in a few questions that maybe we can pick up later during the discussion. So how will we run the seminar, the webinar? So we will start by hearing from Hélène Piaget, the CEO of the Responsible Mining Foundation, about the background of the research and what was that was undertaken. And then Hélène will also introduce some of the voices from the field. There's a number of clips that were compiled, and I would like to show them to you. And then that set then the stage for the panelist interventions. And we've asked each of them to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. So we'll start first with Rohitesh Dhawan, the CEO of the ICMM. Rose followed by Glen Mpufane, who's the Director of Mining at the IndustriALL Global Union. And then after Glen, we will hear from Coumans, the Research Coordinator at MiningWatch Canada. Then after Catherine, we'll hear from Jamie Williamson, who is the Executive Director of the International Code of Conduct Association. And then finally, Gaurav Sarup, Director ESG, Carbon and Social Performance at Vedanta, will finish our closure, finish our panel. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion amongst the panelists to see what can we learn from each other. And then we open it up for questions and answers. In terms of some house rules, actually very few, to be honest. Given the number of participants, we ask you to put your questions and answers in the box, questions and answer box at the bottom of your screen. And then we will select some of those questions. Please make sure that you highlight if it's a question for the entire panel or that you want to ask a question to a particular panelist. And then also the session is recorded in English, French, and Spanish. And you know that you've figured out by now that there is translation. So in case you want to share the discussion with colleagues, please look out for a Zoom message that you hopefully will get early next week with a link to the recording of this. So on that note, let's start. And I'd like to ask Hélène to set the stage for the rest of the discussion. So like I mentioned, Hélène is the CEO of the Responsible Mining Foundation. And Hélène, question to you is, why did the Responsible Mining Foundation undertake the study on harmful impacts? And when you saw the results and the findings, what were some of the findings that stood out, particular findings that stood out for you?
Thank you, Luke, and hello, everybody. So this study actually follows similar studies that we published in 2018 and 2020 as part of the Responsible Mining Index reports. And it's clear that the harmful impacts of mining remain a challenge for society to acknowledge and to address. Those reports were a little bit smaller, and we realized they didn't get enough attention. And so we thought it's time to actually bring this matter to greater attention by giving it its own report. So sustainability reports tend to focus on how responsible companies are about creating positive contributions and managing ESG risks. Yet the term ESG risks, to a degree, has effectively become a euphemism for the potential harmful impacts of mining. We don't call it what it is. While the Responsible Mining Index reports, as you all know, aim to encourage continuous improvement in responsible mining and to highlight leading practices that companies have undertaken and shown, our mailboxes at the RMF are weekly filled with desperate accounts of immiseration caused by mining activities from all corners of the world and pleas for help. And of course, we're only researchers. We cannot solve the problems ourselves, though we understand the importance of bringing attention to the hardship of so many. And we must remember that this is not necessarily to do with the companies that we cover in this report. This is a small sample, effectively, of thousands of mining companies and mining operations around the world. So this inbox of ours really comes from all sorts of places and not linked directly to any of the companies in the report. So what does the report show? It shows that harmful impacts persist, even for the biggest and best resourced companies in the world. And although it covers around 1,000 mine sites, this is just a fraction of the tens of thousands of operations around the world. It must also be noted that mostly these harmful impacts are the result of a lack of adequate corporate measures to prevent harm. In other words, they're not acts of commission, but they're acts of omission, things that happen that shouldn't have happened. So what stands out for me from the report? Well, of course, people will read the report themselves, and next week we'll have the translations in 6 other languages up on the website. But basically, at the top end for me, it's really important to say that harmful impacts of mining are by no means inevitable. But we do need to normalize effective prevention across the industry everywhere, not only amongst big and well-resourced companies. Also, lessons have been learned over the years. So the industry actually knows what needs to be done. But these lessons now need to be shared widely and applied systematically. We often find a great variance in the application of systems between mine sites within the same company, for example. And then we also think these need to be shared, these lessons, across the entire industry, including medium and smaller sized companies that are part of the greater industry and part of the image that the industry actually gets through their activities. And then lastly, I think what stands out for me is that we need a more honest dialogue across society. We should be careful about using phrases like green mining, for example, and that we need courageous leadership with a big L, if I may say, from the industry, but also from other players. I'm going to stop there in my comments, Luke, but I'd also like to move on. And talking about dialogue in society, we'd like to widen the circle of voices today by including some short statements from people either directly affected by harm or working in the context of harmful impacts. And as Luke mentioned in his introduction, everybody's working towards a more zero harm type of environment, and where mining can find its legitimate place as society so much depends on the activities of mining companies. So I would like to introduce you to video messages from Helena Taliberti from Brazil, Robert Ali Tanti from Ghana, Abdul Halim Khan from Pakistan, Richard Soli from the United Kingdom, Prabinda Shakya from Nepal, Herman Sia from Indonesia, and JB Garganera from the Philippines.
My name is Helena, and I am the mother of Luis and Camila Taliberti that died on Brumadinho. Professionals of mining sector, governments, legislators, inspection bodies, mining companies, managers, and board of directors have got to show ethics at first hand. Investors should be aware of their investments, as they are responsible for the present and for the future generation affected by mining companies.
Mining produces a lot of material, such as solid waste, mine particles, and mine water. These are potential pollutants to the environment. And these materials pose a lot of health challenges to communities in mining areas. Mining companies must dispose their waste according to internationally accepted guidelines. This will contribute to the attainment of the SDGs, especially the SDG 3 Target 8, which seeks to reduce them by reducing harmful chemicals and pollution.
Mining continues to be a dangerous activity, whether large-scale industrial mining or small-scale artisanal mining. Coal mine is considered hazardous industry and dangerous occupational the world over. In Pakistan, coal mine has strictly been operated with hazardous such as suffocation gas, poisoning gas, explosion, fires, and other incidents. Thousands of workers are died in the last 3 years.
There must be an effective right of redress where communities have been harmed. Much higher standards of waste management have to be developed, which must apply to all existing tailings facilities, not just new ones. It's essential that we develop a global economy which minimises both energy and material use through improved energy efficiency, better product design, increased reuse of products, and recycling of minerals. The basic needs of all humans must be fulfilled, but we must move away from the consumerism of the wealthy, which generates mountains of waste at the expense of creating human and ecological sacrifice zones.
Based on my experiences of working with mining-affected communities in different Asian countries, I believe the harmful impacts of mining projects are very much preventable. Communities, the indigenous and local communities in the mining-affected areas, they know the resources, the lands the best, so they are the experts for their lands and resources. The meaningful consultations towards obtaining their free, prior, and informed consent for any mining project in their areas would be the first step to prevent any harmful impacts.
Society at large has forgotten that minerals are a shared inheritance, great wealth, and extraction is effectively the sale of this wealth. Miners are capturing a good proportion of this wealth that actually belongs to society at large, and if any harm is caused and there are consequences, they can deal with it later. So how do we prevent harm from mining? We need to change the way we think about minerals, mining, and the way we actually manage it. This requires a far higher level of scrutiny on the process of mining, as well as much greater penalties to make sure that if any of the wealth is stolen or if any harm is created, there are much greater disincentives for this.
Work accidents that cause injury to workers and even death are the situations that occur almost all the time, such as mine collapse, flood, accident leading to mine, and so on. Some of our members suffer from occupational disease. They are exposed to mercury, black lung, some detected after the worker retired. So in the future, companies must involve trade union in the formulating of occupational safety and health policy. Workers must be given basic right, the right to know and have information, the right to refuse unsafe work, and right to participate.
Mining becomes harmful when companies fail to secure the consent and social acceptability from the affected communities. Miners turn a blind eye to the real costs of mining. You have health costs, social costs, environmental costs, cultural costs, especially to an indigenous community. In most instances where a mine has become harmful, we have observed that the mining company has either violated environmental laws or failed to comply with their own contractual obligations.
So it seems that we got our marching orders from around the world, and pretty powerful testimonies from people that say you have to do better. You have to focus on your change in policy, a change in your approach, and at minimum, stick to your own guidelines. And I thought it was also quite interesting to see that the number of the testimony or the voices from the field were focused on that feedback loop and access to remedy and involvement and inclusion of communities in order to make sure that you have that social license to operate. And linking back to Hélène's comments, what I also thought was very interesting, and that's by way of segueing into the presentation by Ro, is that there is a recognition that amongst all the companies that are operating in this space, there is a wide variety, and that there are actually good practices, and that this is not something that cannot be avoided, or that we just is a collateral impact of the way we do business. But there are actually these really good examples. So the challenge, I think, Hélène, that you put out there for us is to say, how do we capture these lessons learned, and how do we share them more widely, both within an organization, but also within the larger industry? And that caused me to think, there's a wonderful opportunity there for an organization or a series of organizations to actually do that, and to make sure who's actually operating in that space. And that leads me to the first presenter of the panel, Dhawan, the CEO of the ICMM. Roh, you can, thanks. Because the ICMM may be an organization that operates in the space, and we know there's a lot of work being done in this space. So, I think most on the call know the ICMM, the International Council on Mining and Metals, consists at the moment of 28 members, mostly larger mining and metal companies, and the association is dedicated to a safe, fair, and sustainable mining and metals industry. So, Roh, wonderful to have you part of the discussion. Question that I wanted to pose to you is that for some years now, when you see these annual reviews, CEOs about what is on their worry list, what keeps them awake at night, the number 1, 2, or 3 concerns is always license to operate. It's the soft issue. It's not how do you get more access to finance, or where do we find the next resource. So on the one side, you see that the CEOs have listed these environmental and social risks as a key priority. But then, for you as a representative of the mining industry, what then makes it so difficult for the industry to become more effective in preventing some of these impacts, especially when we know that some of those impacts are actually preventable?
So, Luke, I'm really grateful that you've given me the opportunity to make some comments, but I'm even more grateful than for the opportunity to listen. And I say that really sincerely, because we can argue about whether calling this session the harmful impacts of mining is appropriate or not. But the reality is that it's an opportunity for us to all learn. So I come here very much with a mindset to understand perspectives, to contribute where we can, but ultimately, hopefully, walk away from the next couple of hours with a better understanding between all of us for how we can prevent harm in mining. So let me answer your question, Luke, with the 3 things from the report that really stood out for me. These are things I passionately believe in. These are things that are core to ICMM, which I think the report brings out really, really clearly. The first of those is that risk is inherent, harm is not. And I'll build on each of these, but let me tell you what all 3 are. The second is that legal compliance is the floor, not the ceiling. And the third is that a public commitment is a necessary but insufficient condition to prevent harm. So let me talk to you about each of these 3 and why they really were the most important aspects for me from the report. First, as long as we are digging great big holes in the ground, or indeed 5 kilometers under the ground, and we have fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters working in those environments, there will be risk. But it doesn't have to mean that there will be harm. And we can take heart from the progress that the industry has made on preventing harm on something like safety. ICMM has, of course, for the last 9 years, published an annual safety report that discloses injuries and fatalities for each one of our 28 member companies. And in 2020, across the ICMM member companies, 44 people lost their lives. Now, in 2012, 90 people lost their lives, with about the same number of hours worked in 2012 as in this year. So that tells us that we can make progress. And the question then becomes, are we willing to leave no stone unturned to make sure that we get to 0 on safety? Because, as I say, there will be risk as long as we are working in environments where there are great big machines and doing hazardous work, there will be risk, but that doesn't mean there needs to be harm. So, Luke, I take heart from the progress we've made on safety. It is absolutely and clearly not enough. And there's a lot more to go. But that's the kind of attitude I hope we all can adopt to ensuring that risk does not have to always mean harm. And I wonder, Luke, if there's an opportunity there to think forward for the same kind of approach and thinking to aspects related to other aspects of harm, like environmental spills and like human rights. You know, where there are mining operations, there is the risk of environmental spills. There is the risk of human rights violations. But let's do everything possible to make sure that while risk is inherent, harm is not. My second point was about how legal compliance ought to be the floor, not the ceiling, for the actions that we all take to prevent harm. And here, Luke, I look to the work on biodiversity, for instance. People will know that ICMM companies have had a commitment to not mine or prospect in World Heritage Sites since 2003. That's not a legal obligation in many countries. That's a voluntary commitment. So once again, can we take maybe we can take some heart from that and use that to encourage ourselves to go even further in other areas where going beyond legal compliance is the right thing to do. Take anti-corruption, for instance. Of course, nobody would argue that being in conformance with laws on anti-corruption is a necessary precondition. That is non-negotiable entirely. But there are perfectly good reasons and important reasons why simply being legally compliant on an issue like anti-corruption may not be enough. And I think there's more we can do there, and there's areas and ways we can go further. So that's my second thought, is that legal compliance is the floor, not the ceiling. And the third is that a public commitment to no harm is a necessary condition, but on its own an insufficient condition to prevent harm. And I think the report gives us food for thought there. And here again, I think about, for example, workplace safety and sexual assault, which is named in the report, and how over the last few years, there's been increasing focus by the industry and by other parties on incidents of sexual assault and where workplace safety has been compromised. And there have been public commitments made by the industry and by others to make sure that we root this out entirely of our workplaces. And I think that sets us on a good path, because when we make a public commitment, we dedicate time, energy, attention, and focus to making sure that happens. But it's not enough, because as we saw, and as the report sets out, there are incidents that continue to happen even after we've made that kind of a public commitment. So we can learn from that. And then that tells me that there are issues where we can adopt the same kind of thinking to go even further. So one aspect that the report touches on is how we need more focus on preventing gradual harm. So there's a lot of focus on events that cause harm, but what about harm that accumulates over time? I think here, for example, about health impacts from prolonged exposure to diesel particulate emissions from mining vehicles. And here, once again, we've been working in this area for the last 3 years, but there's a lot more to do. And it tells us that when we make a public commitment, it galvanizes us to really focus our energy. But that's only the beginning, because the reality will be it will only be met through sustained action over time. So Luke, I'll stop there to say that I really appreciated, as I say, the chance to share my reflections on the report and the 3 things that really stood out for me. But I'm particularly appreciative to be able to listen to the perspectives of others. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ro. That's a wonderful intervention. And there's 2 pieces that came to mind when I heard you. One is this notion about making a public commitment as necessary but not enough. And I think it's actually quite interesting to also go back to the Responsible Mining Index and the report that will come out, I think, in 2022 again, in terms of making a commitment and how does a commitment then lead to actions and how do actions lead to effectiveness. So commitment indeed is the first step. And I also really liked your emphasis on the gradual harm, because indeed it is easier to focus on the events that get a lot of airtime, but there's indeed a number of those more gradual harms that often go kind of unnoticed, and then we're surprised about it. So thanks very much, and I think sets up the stage for the next presenter and also for questions afterwards. And just a reminder, if you have any questions to any of the presenters, then put them in the Q&A box. Thanks very much, Ro. We come back to you. Glen, can I ask you to come on? So, hi, Glen. So we move over to hearing from a union perspective. And Glen Mpufane is the director mining, and then not only mining operations, but also manufacturing, the manufacturing side in terms of gems, diamonds, ordnance, so the whole manufacturing and mining industry with the IndustriALL Global Union. And I didn't know about this, Glen, but I see, or I read, that the union represents 50 million workers in 140 countries in the mining, energy, and manufacturing sector to fight for better working conditions and for trade union rights. So massive organization, global reach. And my question to you was, Glen, along the same lines, like the RMF report has given an indication of the scale of the human cost borne by mining workers, varying from fatalities and Ro mentioned serious injuries to debilitating occupational diseases, some of those gradual harms that Ro was talking about. So why do you think that even well-resourced and large mining companies that were basically the subject of this report are still seeing high levels of occupational health and safety impacts?
Thank you very much, Luke, for the introduction, and thanks to the RMF for the invitation, and hello everybody. Let me dive straight into my input, and the point of departure, of course, is the RMF Harmful Impacts Report, which describes worker fatalities as a persistent challenge. We could not agree more. If Brumadinho, as we heard, is anything to go by, Samarco, Pakistan's coal mining killing fields, as we heard from the video, Kazakhstan, the latest mining accident, mining accidents around the world, and not to mention the silent killer, occupational diseases that go often unreported. According to the ICMM Safety Performance Benchmark report, as we've heard for 2020, regrettably in 2020, ICMM company members recorded 44 occupational fatalities. And we heard this compares to 287 fatalities recorded in 2019 and 50 fatalities recorded in 2018. Now, the fact that in 2020, 12 of its member companies reported zero fatality does not make these figures acceptable. The mining industry is failing mine workers, and part of the reason is the refusal or reluctance of some of the mining companies to accept the well-meaning gesture of outreach for dialogue from trade unions to collaboratively and in the ILO tripartite dialogue spirit, work towards the zero harm ambition, which we share, of course. If I may, just a little bit about the ILO convention landscape, because it's important to workers and to trade unions. It may not be to the mining industry. The ILO tripartite social dialogue has produced one of the most far-reaching ILO conventions on health and safety in the mines, ILO Convention 1995, number 176, and the accompanying codes of recommendation 183. Now, from our vantage point, these are important guidance towards the zero harm objective. However, oftentimes when we raise the importance of these guidance protocols, mining companies or some mining companies tell us or tell workers or trade unions that ILO conventions are not meant for them, but governments. And by default, mining companies will comply when these are ratified. Now we know that not all mining country jurisdictions have ratified the convention, and all we are asking from mining companies is to work with trade unions to have this convention ratified, because it is very important to stem in the tide of carnage that we see in the mining industry. Besides, we believe that it is not best practice to default, as mining companies do, to applicable country laws and regulation legislation in the absence of ILO convention ratification, where legislation is lower than best practice. Is that acceptable to us? Best practice is that a mining company shall comply with whichever provides the greatest occupational health and safety protection of country laws or other applicable instrument. If complying with the other instrument would require the company to break country law, the company shall comply with the intent of the applicable instrument. Now, this is best practice, and this comes from one of the responsible mining standards, which is the IRMA. Sometimes we get the feeling that the mining industry is perhaps ignorant, particularly the important social dialogue dimension. It is not as Rowe said that it is not about compulsion. Social dialogue is there. You are not compelled to engage in social dialogue. We think that it behooves the companies to engage with the conventions or familiarize with the conventions and have conversations with their trade unions about these conventions. Another convention that is very, very important to us and big piece of this conversation, and we've heard from our members across the world in the mining space, labor inspection protocols that are violated. In fact, in Pakistan, we've had just some jurisdiction ban labor inspection. How do you do that? And it is in this context that we feel that mine workers have been left down or are being let down by governments on this important protocol. In some instances, we've seen that mining companies have taken governments to court, on the question of labor inspections. How do you, in moral conscience, do that? Only trade unions have shown commitment to implement these protocols, and they cannot do it alone. And I'm emphasizing this because it came out of the harmful impact report. And embedded, which is an advantage, embedded to this protocol is the tripartite and bipartite social dialogue, which is crucial to building trust, a much needed factor in occupational health and safety mitigation. Without trust, you won't go far. And to conclude, I'd like to point to a research study commissioned by the Institute of Occupational Health and Safety, IOSH, and the study was about representing miners in arrangements for safety and health in coal mining. It was conducted by Professor David Walters. It makes this important finding, about the important role and contribution of health and safety representatives under certain conditions, principally support from trade unions, mining companies, regulatory bodies, and the ILO. And I think as mining companies and governments, if we can focus on what the intentions of Convention 176. Australia has not ratified Convention 176. However, the OHS performance is on par, if not better, in some cases with countries that have ratified 176, simply because their regime is aligned to OHS Convention 176. And with those few words, I think our contribution will set the stage for a debate and questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Glen. That's a lot of food for thought, and I like the various points you made in terms of, because they start to link together. And I think the first point about refusing, or the importance of dialogue with everybody, is something that we heard from the people in the video in terms of having a dialogue going. But what I also found interesting, Glen, is that you mentioned that some of the experience you've had is that the companies are still, some of your experiences, that some companies are still hiding behind what actually is national legislation. And it goes back to Rose's point earlier, that the legal requirements are the floor, not the ceiling. And I think that really nicely dovetails with what you had to say. And I also would say, if we put in here the human guiding principles, then there is a clear floor. There is, if a government does not subscribe, or government regulations are below international standards, then it's clear what the responsibility of companies are in that respect. And then your point about intent, I think, is a powerful one. And it goes back to Helene's earlier point about what kind of company do you want to be and what is the leadership? Are you providing an assurance program that follows intent, or do you follow assurance by the letter? But also points back to the governments, like you mentioned. Does the government say, well, we have our laws and we have a regulatory function, but it's okay, the company can demonstrate something and therefore by the letter, and therefore we're okay with what we see? Or indeed, do we hold companies accountable based on the intent of how the law was designed? Exactly. So lots of good food for thought. Thanks very much. And I'm sure we come back to that at a later stage. Thanks, Glen. So then moving on to Catherine. Catherine Coumans is the researcher, senior researcher of MiningWatch Canada, and I think many of us know MiningWatch Canada. It's a civil society organization that is critically following the mining industry, with the aim of changing public policy but also mining practices to ensure that the health of individuals, communities, and ecosystems is guaranteed. So, Catherine, you are a very known person in the industry, in civil society. You've done a lot of research. You have done a lot of. You have written a lot of reports about various companies, various geographical areas, different human rights related issues for a long time. From your perspective on the preventability of harmful impacts, what do you think needs to happen to improve prevention?
Thank you, Luc. Well, I'd like to start by commending the Responsible Mining Foundation for documenting and reporting on the harmful impacts of mining. As mineral extraction is escalating globally, it is indeed, to quote from the report, more important than ever to acknowledge the harm that mining causes and to raise awareness of the urgent need for mining companies and regulators to take stronger action to prevent such negative impacts and more actively support responsible mineral supply chains. However, as some of you may remember, that exactly 20 years ago, we went through an industry-led, multi-year, multi-stakeholder global discussion about the harmful impacts of mining and what should be done about them. It was called the Global Mining Initiative. At that time, 20 years ago, IISD wrote, and I'm quoting, "The mining and minerals industry has come under tremendous pressure to improve its social, developmental, and environmental performance. They are also increasingly being asked to be more transparent and subject to third-party audit or review," unquote. Instead, around the same time as the GMI process got underway between 2000 and 2002, and in the years since its report of Breaking New Ground came out, there's been a proliferation of voluntary multi-stakeholder initiatives, or MSIs, geared towards addressing one or another of the harmful impacts of mining. The Voluntary Principles, EITI, the Global Reporting Initiative, the Kimberley Initiative, the Diamond Development Initiative, and many more. A review of some of these efforts in July of 2020 led MSI Integrity to conclude that MSIs are not designed or equipped to be effective tools protecting human rights, protecting rights holders against human rights violations, holding companies accountable for abuse, or providing survivors and victims with access to remedy. Having been at the table for some of these initiatives, I can confidently say that one reason that these multi-stakeholder initiatives fall short of their own ambitions is the very role that industry participants and government participants that are supportive of their corporate nationals play in maintaining weak accountability provisions, such as in these mechanisms, their governance structures, their compliance assessment procedures, and their transparency. In Canada, we've recently seen a similar undermining of an effort to create human rights accountability when, after receiving a firm commitment from the Government of Canada that newly created corporate accountability ombudsperson would be equipped to investigate complaints with the powers to compel documents and witness testimony, these powers were not granted after all, following a fierce industry lobby led by the Mining Association of Canada. Before turning to what I believe is the most promising option for preventing harm caused or contributed to by mining, and for creating a path to remedy for those who have been harmed, I will briefly sketch two cases I've been involved in over many years by way of illustration. One is the Porgera joint venture mine in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and the other, the North Mara mine in Tanzania. At both of these mines, there were very strong and clear indications over many years that private mine security and police guarding these mines under memorandums of understanding were implicated in ongoing human rights abuses, including beatings, rapes, gang rapes, shootings, and killings of local men, women, and children. In the case of the Porgera mine, for example, the company was made aware of the issues related to excess use of force by mine security as early as 2005. Starting in 2008, Porgerans traveled all the way to Canada from Papua New Guinea yearly to attend the company's annual general meetings in Toronto, in which they publicly addressed the assembled shareholders and directors and told them about the security-related killings and rapes. In Canadian parliamentary hearings in 2009 and 2010, academic researchers from Harvard and New York universities and I testified about the violence based on our own research findings, and Canadian media reported on the issues. It was not until late in 2010 that the company in question acknowledged some of the security-related violence at the Porgera mine. In the case of the North Mara gold mine, the same company only reacted after legal action was initiated in the UK on behalf of victims in 2013. At both mines, the company responded by putting in place project-level grievance mechanisms that were used strategically to undermine existing legal action in the case of the North Mara mine and to address legal risk in the case of the Porgera mine. At the North Mara mine, mine personnel sought out the clients in the lawsuit and offered them compensation packages in return for dropping their legal action and signing legal waivers against any future legal action. At the Porgera mine, the company implemented a time-limited grievance mechanism narrowly focused on victims of sexual assault only by private mine security. And again, compensation was only provided in return for a legal waiver. At both mines, there were many more human rights abuses that have yet to receive acknowledgement, let alone remedy. Note that the Canadian company in question is a member of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights and references this membership when faced with allegations of excess use of force by its mine security and police guarding its mines. This 20-year-old multi-stakeholder initiative is a particularly weak and non-transparent mechanism, as among others, it lacks independent auditing to ensure that members are complying with the guidelines. It does not allow third parties, such as rights holders, to file complaints, and it does not report publicly on any complaints that may be brought or dealt with internally. A different outcome would have been possible for the victims of human rights abuses at the Porgera and North Mara mines had mandatory human rights due diligence legislation been in force in Canada. MiningWatch Canada and other members of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability are proposing legislation that imposes a duty on corporations to assess and prevent adverse human rights impacts and environmental damage throughout their global operations and supply chains. The legislation includes meaningful consequences for companies that fail to carry out and report on adequate due diligence, and establishes a legal right for people who have been harmed to seek justice in Canadian courts. It is time, finally, for a real game changer. We encourage mining companies and industry associations such as ICMM and the Mining Association of Canada to demonstrate their desire to prevent and address mining-related harms, such as those identified in the RMF report, by supporting the implementation of human rights due diligence legislation in Canada and in other countries where such legislation is being proposed. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. That is a very passionate and articulate plea for increased legislation and indeed human rights due diligence. And I think it would be very interesting to also hear later on to see, to what extent we can actually in places like Canada and other places learn from some of the legislation that's already underway, in particular in Europe at the moment, and what it actually means for companies to actually say, this is now part of the regulatory framework. What I've seen is actually has been quite powerful from a human rights due diligence perspective, is that many companies still feel this whole human rights beast is a bit of a scary one, and whereas in fact, if you look at it from human rights due diligence, it is actually really kind of very strategic in prioritizing your most salient risks, and it is not rocket science. It is really kind of prioritizing those areas where you have the most impact. And from a company perspective, that is actually a much more attractive proposition, as opposed to saying, well, let's do an audit and go through all the different standards that are applied, because it is really targeted. So we'd love to hear you maybe later on your perspective in terms of how we can in some ways learn from the lessons from other places where this legislation already is in place or is actually at the verge of being rolled out. So thanks very much for that. Good, then from Catherine, Jamie, can you come online? And I had, thank you, Jamie. So Jamie, I had even a little bit of a background. So now, of course, so Jamie is the CEO of the International Code of Conduct Association. Conduct Association, you have to help me. Oh, here it is a multi-stakeholder initiative, Jamie, and you explained it earlier this week. It was formed in 2013, and it is really focusing on ensuring that providers of private security services are respecting human rights, but also international humanitarian law, which I thought was a very nice combination indeed. And it is really wonderful to have you here, Jamie, because as you know, particularly in the mining industry, there is a concern that in terms of human rights abuses, the role that security providers play, both private security providers as well as public security providers, is a concern, because often it's associated with human rights impact and indeed abuses. So also following up, actually it's nicely dovetailing with the presentation we just heard from Catherine, despite there is the fact that efforts like the voluntary principles are broadly supported by most people in the mining industry, why do you think that there is still such a widespread issue related to security providers and human rights impacts? And actually what needs to be done to address that issue?
Thank you very much, Luke, and to all the participants. And I think the question you've just given me is somewhat provocative, but fortunately, as you mentioned, Catherine's intervention a few seconds ago was actually, I think, laid the groundwork quite nicely for this section of our discussions. As you rightly pointed out, so I run an international association which brings together governments, civil society organizations, and private security companies in particular to focus on the implementation of an international code of conduct for private security providers. And this is done through various processes from certification, but in particular through in-country as well as remote monitoring and verification of the operations of security providers. Your question with regard to, and I think rebounding on some of the comments that Catherine had as well, on the despite the existence of, for instance, the Voluntary Principles Initiative, but also other multi-stakeholder organizations out there focusing particularly on the mining industry, we are still seeing question marks with regard to the harm being caused by private security contractors with certain mining entities in different parts of the world. And there have been quite a few headlines in the past few months, and Catherine mentioned a couple of them in her intervention. And we're also seeing, I think, a confusion at some level in the discussion in terms of what exactly are security forces involved in the operation of mining companies. The report that we're going through at present, it's great because it does speak to both private security and public security, but it unfortunately puts everything under that label of security forces. So going back to, I think, your question, the first thing I would say is that the Voluntary Principles Initiative is not meant to offer all of the answers, in my mind. And this is not to downgrade the importance of what the initiative offers as a mechanism in terms of bringing human rights principles to the table, speaking about public and private security contractors and public security forces in relationship with companies, and also how to carry out a risk assessment. But I think, as Catherine rightly pointed out, the Voluntary Principles Initiative focuses predominantly on the kind of a guidance to be given to the companies. And by the companies, we're speaking here of the companies that have signed up to the voluntary principles, predominantly from the extractive industry. And it's guidance in terms of the kinds of principles that they should implement to ensure that they're meeting their human rights obligations and other obligations under international law. So the existence of the voluntary principles and the commitment shown by the companies to those principles, in my mind, is simply the first step towards the more important aspect, which is implementation. Because as Catherine pointed out, the voluntary principles have a verification process, but it's a very light one. It looks particularly at questions of policies and procedures, which are important and helps to guide companies to improve those. But the practical aspects are lacking. And this is where the integrated approach of what we're all trying to do in this regard is particularly important. The association looks specifically, my association looks specifically at the questions of private security companies, in particular in high risk and complex environments. And those environments where there may be weak governance, a weakened rule of law, and other issues with regard to oversight of security elements, be they private as well as public. And so it's through our work that we're trying to improve that oversight, monitoring, and accountability elements of the private security sector. Now, at one level, we can engage with the private security companies themselves to have that discussion, to bring them to the table, to ensure that they're part of this process, and then work with the national authorities, as we're a multi-stakeholder organization, to ensure that where there are shortcomings, accountability is in place and judicial remedies, not simply financial and compensatory remedies, but judicial remedies where you have abuses of human rights as well as humanitarian law. But key in all of this is going up the supply chain, the clients, in other words, those that use the security providers. What are their responsibilities? How do we interact with them? Because without the clients and the demand on the part of clients, we're not going to see higher standards necessarily on the part of private security companies in certain contexts. So there's a high level of responsibility, and I dare say a shared responsibility on the part of the clients, and for this particular forum, the mining sector, the extractive sector, but all the other sectors in different parts of the world that use security have a similar responsibility. So the clients have to show leadership in this regard. And in my mind, that leadership is not being met if we're only referring to commitments to voluntary principles in general, without demonstrating that implementation aspect of what is required to ensure that we're seeing more transparency and accountability in the sector. The report has got some bottom line comments, observations, as well as recommendations. And many of them actually meet with some of the experiences that we have come across over the past few years. To note a few, and hopefully this will be part of the discussion during this particular webinar. The first, I think, in-house, there seems still to be a level of confusion, or at least a spectrum in terms of how we approach the question of security. On the one side, many folk look at corporate social responsibility as the way in to managing security issues and looking at private security issues. And quite often the CSR piece, as well as the ESG piece, which is now coming into many of the discussions, falls short in its recognition of what human rights standards and human rights requirements actually look like. So CSR file holders or desks in mining sort of environments quite often won't know the United Nations guiding principles inside out. They won't have that human rights expertise which is required to go beyond CSR. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, you have the security managers themselves, be they regional, country, site managers. They'll have a great focus on the technical aspects of what security should look like. And that won't necessarily marry with the human rights component. And in many of our interactions with different clients, including in those in the sort of extractive sector, we're seeing this disconnect between the technical and the CSR, and this vacuum when it comes to the human rights understanding expertise and is what is required. And that makes its way up to the board, to leadership. And so I think this recommendation here in terms of courageous leadership is very much required. There is a need for leadership and understanding that the UN guiding principles, the work of our association, human rights standards, etc., are not simply CSR issues or ESG issues or some technical aspects we need to look at. They're much more complex, but quite simple if you sort of break them down into very basic elements. A second component that we have noticed, and it's good that Catherine mentioned and put the focus on the in-house private mining security or the security for the mining entities. Quite often we interact with clients in the extractive industry who will say to us they don't use private security. And for them, the non-use of private security is the fact that they don't outsource their security to a private contractor. They simply rely on their in-house private security. Unless that mining sort of company is a government-owned and government-run entity, it is a private entity. So its own in-house security is likewise private security, and it should be treated as a private contractor as such. So there's no reason why we can't have that discourse with those clients with regard to their in-house security. The third-party independent verification piece is the last point I'll make here. And this goes back to the question of transparency and to courageous leadership and to interaction with different stakeholder groups, which the voluntary principles do speak to. A risk assessment requires gathering of the relevant information and not simply in-house detailed information. And the verification piece, if we're going to strengthen oversight and accountability, in my mind, requires that reliance on third-party independent verification processes. So for instance, our association with regard to how we work with private security companies. And in my mind, the mining sector should see that as a positive rather than a kind of a gotcha approach, which is to say, by working with other entities, such as this association or others on security matters, then we are going to address those prevention issues. And rather than dealing with harm, we will be minimizing the risk and addressing any potential shortfalls in the security setup. Luke, I'll pause here, being aware of the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. That's a wonderful intervention, and I lots of food for thought. I really like the idea that you're very much focusing on the prevention side, and I also wanted to link your observation, which I think is so spot on, in this gap that you noted between, on the one side, the CSR folks, the ESG folks, and then on the other side, the technical departments within the organization. And I think you're bang on that there is a gap there. By the mere fact that in that space, we don't see mining companies on a corporate level. We have human rights experts, but on a site level, it's still quite rare to see human rights experts. So we have the CSR department or the social performance department on the one side, but then who's responsible for that guiding principles piece? And I think that also then links back to Catherine's earlier point about the need for a more cross-functional human rights due diligence approach. So and not to have a bunch of consultants coming in from time to time to do human rights impact assessment, but to really kind of integrate that mechanism, the systems, to make sure that at any point in time, as a company, you know what your impacts are going to be, and that's also what the guiding principles require, rather than to say write us a report and what the impacts are. So I think that's a really nice way to say there is something in that space, and we need to strengthen that. Yeah, and then the piece about third-party verification came up earlier, and I think that's a nice one. And I think maybe in the second round, we have time for it. it's interesting that we keep talking about courageous leadership, but I think that in some ways we have also seen that courageous leadership is you get a new CEO and things change quite dramatically. So it's also how can we actually solidify some of those and integrate some of those ideas that you had about, you know, paradigm shift. This is not about gotcha. This is about getting out of it and prevention. So hopefully there will be some questions from the audience to you later, Jamie. But thanks very much. Then we go to Gaurav. Gaurav, can you come online? Yes, thanks.
Hello.
So it's late evening. Hi, Gaurav. It's late evening in Delhi. Gaurav is the Director ESG, Carbon and Social Performance with Vedanta. Vedanta is a globally diversified natural resources company, has mining operations, a lot of them, and a lot in India, oil and gas assets, has refinery, smelters, and is a real global player. So wonderful to have you part of the discussion, Gaurav. And what is interesting, of course, is that you're sitting on a corporate level. So you have a really kind of a bird's eye perspective. You have the overview. So it is interesting to get that company perspective in terms of what you see as a challenging in preventing harmful impacts at mine sites. And what would be nice if you could maybe discuss one or two examples of where you've seen that some of the operations had some harmful impacts, and what kind of lessons learned were taken from that from a company perspective.
Sure, Luke, thanks for the question. And also I want to thank the RMF team for initiating such a panel, because these discussions are important to have from time to time and get this global diverse perspective that we're getting on the call today. And also congratulate them on the report that's just come out. Reading that report and looking at the 10 key observations that the report brings out, it's almost like the conversation that we were having internally within the team, right? All of those 10 points resonate with anybody who's practicing in this space, whether it's around grievance or whether it's around redressal, or around how compliance should not be the floor, as Ro was talking about. All of those resonate very, very deeply. But to me on this call today, there were a couple of comments that Glen and Catherine made, which kind of sum, how mining companies should interact with, or what are the expectations that mining people have from mining companies, and that's really around fair play. And that's this is one of those things that even when we go out to our different locations and speak to the local stakeholders, talk to the tribal communities, or talk to the communities who are directly living around our mining and smelting operations, they don't talk about wild demands from companies, right? They talk about fair play. They talk about no harm to their physical assets or to their local environments, and they talk about access to dialogue. Right? And in a nutshell, those comments that Glen and Catherine were making kind of summarize those fundamental requirements. And outside of all of the standards and policies that all of our mining companies adhere to, so whether it's the IFC performance standards or what the ICMM puts out, it's those fundamentals that kind of drive thinking for us, at least at the corporate level at Vedanta. And when I look at the role that most corporate functions fail and play out, it's essentially around ensuring that we bring out visibility to any harm that's been caused on site, right? So key to, given the diverse nature of our operations, given that we are spread out all across the corners of the country, it is easy for harm to be put under cover unless you have very strong systems and communication within the company and intention within the company to make sure that everything comes on the table, small, big, doesn't matter. And once we do that is only when we can start to rectify rectify and seek remedy. So I think that piece is critical to any corporate function, and we do that a lot when we're talking about ESG and sustainability and human rights and social license to operate here at Vedanta. We also, one of the other roles that being central allows us to do is we scout the world for best practices and standards and conversations such as these, right? I've taken 2 or 3 points just around security and human rights that we just heard on the call just now from Jamie. And it's those things that we kind of take back to our site locations and to our management teams and say, look, here's where the world is headed. We've got the standards in place, but we need to update and improve in such and such areas. And the last piece is around disclosure. And here we want to ensure that there is accurate, complete, and timely reporting of what's going on within our company, both internally, and internally is very, very important, as important as the external reporting that we do to the outside world, because it's in the internal exco and management meetings where these topics are talked about, where incidents are brought to highlight, where analysis is put on paper. It's these interactions that really allow us to move forward on the remedy piece, right? So that's kind of, it sounds kind of easy and nice to say on paper, but really for a large company, and many of our people on the call today might be facing this, is the flow of information really is where we start to see the roadblocks and the challenges. And getting rid of that, making sure that people understand what we're trying to do, making sure that the intent is not to finger point and blame, but to improve. That's really where good corporate teams can play a huge role in driving the agenda forward. I do want to kind of give an example and kind of allude to what both Jamie and Catherine were saying about how all of this plays out on a site. And the role, Jamie talked about how CSR is often given the accountability or the responsibility to dealing with the company and everything with communities and everything that goes along with that. At Vedanta, we also had a similar mindset until very recently, right? Everything that our communities brought to the table was given to the CSR team to handle, whether it was an issue around pollution or whether it was an issue around late payments or whether it's an issue on employment. Everything's supposed to be handled by CSR. And what we realized was that really was not doing the trick. And there was a lot of unhappiness within the communities. There was trust issues because things were not getting resolved. There was a sense that the company is not listening to us and they're just in it for themselves. What we decided, and this is also with the help of experts such as yourself, Luke, that we want to make sure that there are cross-functional teams in place, that when issues start to emerge from communities and from external stakeholders, that there is a proper channel for them to seek, and grievance mechanisms and all of those redressal channels are the first step. But the second step to that is really they should get routed to the right people in the system, and they should rise up to the right levels within the organization so that the immediate issue can be remedied, but also that if there is a systemic failure, that systemic failure can also be taken care of. So, we are currently running a program at one of our locations in the state of Orissa in India. And that's really one of those locations that Vedanta is infamous for, unfortunately, because of our interactions with tribal communities there. But the program that we're running there is really to get the internal management team to understand how this cross-functional way of functioning will work, how it benefits the site, and really how that can enhance the kind of dialogue and discussions and trust that the community has with the company officials. And it's early days yet in that program, but I'm quite happy to say that just recently after many years, actually, the company opened its doors to all external stakeholders, and village leaders, community members, members of local organizations were all asked to come in and just talk about their experiences with the company, and the company on the other side talked about what their intentions are moving forward in terms of enhanced transparency. And people came in with a lot of cynicism, but I think they left with some sort of grudging appreciation. Early days yet, but I think that's kind of what we're seeing, that the kind of transparency that cross-functional teams can bring. And so as a corporate function, our role essentially becomes that we want to keep the focus on these issues. We want to make sure that wherever there are opportunities for things that might go off the track, we bring them back on the rails and ensure that there is constant learning taking place within the organization. I just want to close with a couple of things on lessons learned, right? Because it's really important from where we sit to look at the big picture and look at all the perspectives and all the voices, right? There might be certain internal group things which might lead the company to believe a certain thing. But once you hear all the voices, there is a different scenario that emerges. So that's the role of the corporate function. In many cases, when you're looking at change management exercises, I think being on the ground really helps. Sitting at a central office somewhere far away from the site, you may not get the best picture, and really going out on site and talking to all of the stakeholders, at least in my experience, has helped a lot in defining how these programs are finally laid out. And the last piece is just be ready for the long haul, right? It's not going to change overnight. There are people involved, there are old practices involved, and it just takes time to remedy. But I think the intent very clearly is to make sure that whatever harm there is, whatever lack of trust there is, whatever loss of communication there is, we want to rectify that and make sure that we actually normalize prevention of harm as the report talks about. So I'll leave it at that, Luke, and hopefully we get some good questions and discussions on this.
Thanks, Gaurav. That's thanks, wonderful, and also thanks for providing us a bit of an insight into these corporate dynamics. The insight, and what struck me is really kind of the importance you placed on. We have the information. How do we get the information to the right levels, and then to act on that information, which I think is something we didn't hear before. But it's and then I think the other important element you mentioned is about that role of corporate culture. So you have people on the ground, and if you have this sense that impacts happen outside the gate, and outside the gate is a responsibility for CSR, and you compartmentalize it rather than to say the way we hire, the way we do our security, the way we do our emissions, the way we have our operations, all that has an impact, and therefore it is a shared collective responsibility. You explained how difficult it is to kind of how challenging it is to actually internally turn that ship. So I think that was that change management piece, what you mentioned, very, very important. So thanks for that. We get back to that. I see there are some questions rolling in, which is wonderful. We keep them coming. Pierre and Jennifer in the background are making some selections, and then we feed it back to the panel. Before we do that, we are on time. What I would like to do is to go back to the panel members, and basically a very simple question. And I think Gaurav already mentioned that he picked up some elements from Jamie and Catherine. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists, maybe starting with you again, Ro, in terms of, are there, having listened to all the panelists, are there maybe one or two insights that you say, interesting, I hadn't thought about that kind of angle, or some solution, or I would say solution, that sounds a little bit too glib, but is there something that you say either that rung home, or something that you feel needs to be emphasized, so that we can learn from each other and continue that discussion? Over to you.
Thank you, Luke. And there are many, but if I was to pick on one, it was a theme in Jamie's presentation, which others touched on as well. But Jamie used a very interesting word that made me think very deeply. The word he used was how to manage complex interactions. Now, the reason, Luke, that really appealed to me is because as I reflect on my own perspectives of how these things happen that lead to harm, and the finding of the report that what is really required is courageous leadership. I've been thinking a lot about how I personally, and others may be making the same mistake as me, but I know I make the mistake sometimes, of seeing a situation as complicated when in fact it is complex. Now that might sound, especially to a non-English native speaker, as me being silly to split hairs, but in fact they mean very different things. A complicated situation is one in which there is a bounded set of possible outcomes, and you have to work very hard within clearly bounded variables to arrive at an answer. But if you work hard enough and if you can explore enough of the possibilities, you can get to an answer and you can program an algorithm. Typically, complicated situations are very well dealt with by algorithms. But in fact, almost every one of the incidents of harm that is covered in the report have to do with complex systems. Complex systems are ever-changing, unpredictable, and cannot be easily assessed and planned for in advance. And that requires a totally different mindset and a totally different style of leadership and empathy and understanding and mental models that I think are at the root cause of why things go wrong when they're not meant to go wrong. Hélène spoke about a lot of the causes of harm being errors of omission rather than commission. So these are things that we ought to have been able to anticipate and plan for, but we didn't. And my experience, Luke, has been that very few of those come down to malice. Now, it could be that I'm either being naive or perhaps not looking hard enough, but I certainly have not found incidents of malice in my interactions in the industry. What I have found is perhaps insufficient ability, and here I'm making it personal again. I'm saying these are my shortcomings, and others may reflect these too, that we often see situations as complicated when in reality they are complex, which then means equipping people to think differently, act differently, be empowered in different ways, because you respond to a changing situation as opposed to the situation you thought you might encounter. So I'll stop there, Luke. That was my one key takeaway.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ro. Can I actually ask all the other panel members to come online as well? What I think is wonderful, Ro, in terms of starting to unpack the issues we're dealing with. So this whole distinction about being complex or complicated, I think, is a wonderful way to kind of, how does it actually, like you say, that has different consequences for competency management. Or what do we train? How are people in the organizations trained? What are the skills required? The leadership, that courageous leadership we're talking about. That's an easy way to say. What does that mean? But you help us unpack a little bit about what the differences are. So, yeah, very insightful. Thank you very much. Glen, can I ask you, are there a few points that resonated with you listening to the other panelists?
Yeah, I think for me, the issue around courageous leadership, and should not blind us to the need for courageous conversations. Courageous conversations that basically, strip off the pretense, I mean, health and safety is, you die, you're dead, right? You have an occupation, it's serious stuff. And that is why it is important, even to get there, how do we prevent and mitigate? Even given that for mine workers, there's no access to remedy to speak of, and that is why in this space you see the the legal route essentially, whether it is a lawsuits, or even at a national level, and it's very expensive for us, to go that route. And unless we have courageous conversations, with experts. Workers are experts. They do these things every day. They might not have degrees and so on, but at the end of the day, they know the situation better. So why don't we then take them in our confidence, and that will, for us, build trust, as I mentioned, which is very, very important for us. Independent third-party verification, it's late in the day, but in terms of, building that confidence, because, trust then is really the results that, we cannot trust mining companies. We cannot, particularly at site level, which might be doing things that are different, from the script at the corporate level, and when you raise these things, the response is that issues are best resolved at the site level, and then therefore access to remedy is denied, so to speak, So for us, it's those questions around courageous leadership, building trust, and of course, what remedy, because ultimately, the cost of all this health and safety is externalized, basically. It does not appear on the balance sheet of these companies, And this is very serious, conversations that we must have. And we need to take the first steps with mining companies, with ICMM to start with, as a counterpart of Industrial Global Union. We've been reaching out to them. Nothing has come from that. And that's basically, I think, my takeaway, really. And I hope Dhawan takes this as well, that we need to have these courageous conversations. Looking forward to that outreach.
Thanks, Glen. I think that's an invitation you sent out there. So that's a good one. And that's why we have these discussions, right? To be sitting around the table and address these issues. The point you made also about courageous leadership versus courageous dialogue is an important one, because I think what I pick up from that is that we need to provide also the venues by which we can have these courageous dialogue tables. So that it doesn't always become depending on the leadership, because if that leadership doesn't show up at a certain time, then we still have the impact. So I hope that by having conversations like this, and I hope that the report actually provides a bit of an incentive to put something on the table and to say, no, we need to have that discussion, and we're not going to wait. If we have courageous leadership, fantastic, but we're not going to wait for it. We need to have a courageous dialogue. So I think that's I really like that point. Catherine, can I get over to you? Is there any points that you wanted to follow up, or anything that was of interest to you or stood out for you?
Yeah, definitely a lot, actually. One thing that is heartening is the fact that we can now have a report that just starts out by saying, yes, there is harm. It's ongoing, and it's not going away. And even though there was some pushback on that, apparently the title, after 20 years, that we've been talking about the harm, we should be able to put it on the table and say, it's still a problem. What are we going to do about it? And what I heard from the panelists that I thought was really important is, first of all, the recognition that harm is continuous. Second of all, I heard a lot of things that you could put under the heading of the words that you used, Luke. It's not rocket science. I heard a lot of discussion about the fact we have ways to assess our risks, the risks to human rights and to the environment through our supply chains and through our operations. We have that ability, and we can therefore prevent that harm. But what I think is missing is the systematization of that assessment and that prevention, those preventions. So what mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence would provide companies is, it would be a duty, it would be through legislation, but it would require that they, every year, on a continuous basis, do an assessment of all of the potential risks to workers and communities and others involved in their operations, the risks that they may hurt human rights or may harm environments. This is an ongoing obligation. So this will immediately kick it out of the CSR departments and the ESG departments. It will immediately put it in front of the board of directors, because this is a duty and obligation on the company to continuously be assessing the potential risks and how they can mitigate those risks or offset those risks or avoid those risks. And where this is also really important is it takes it out of the internal communications, because very often, you know, what I've heard from people who sit at those internal communications tables in the company, the risk gets seen as, okay, what are we going to do about this? How it doesn't get into the public, it doesn't get into the media, we can quash this threat to us. It's seen as a threat to the company, not as a threat to the community or the workers or the environment. But by having to report on the risk assessment that's been done yearly, so that they have to actually report out on it in the proposed legislation for Canada yearly. And people, they would be providing this report to a commissioner. The commissioner would actually check to make sure that it really does cover all of their business relations and that it covers all of the areas that need to be covered, all human rights. But also people could provide comments. So those reports are made public. So for example, in the cases I gave of the Porgera and the North Mara mine, where you know, for years, the company was being told, your security people, your private and public security, are killing our people, are beating our people, are raping our women. If that doesn't show up in the company's yearly report, there's no mention of this, then anyone, civil society or the people in Porgera or the people in North Mara, can actually write comments. And those comments are also made public and say, hey, hang on a minute, there's nothing in your report about this harm that you're doing to us. And yet we've been telling you about it. Those comments are also made public. So transparency becomes an issue. Systematization becomes an issue. Transparency becomes an issue. If the companies don't prepare these reports, there's a fine. The commissioner can issue a fine. If people are harmed, they can go to court. Now, this is a last option. This is, you know, access to remedy, but it's a last option. But at that point, if they're going to court and that company has not prepared good due diligence reports or has ignored issues, then that will become more difficult for the company to defend itself in court. So the court is like a last ditch thing, but it also creates an incentive. It creates an incentive back on the company to make sure it does good reporting, because in case it goes to court, it wants to be able to show that it's done good reporting and that it's done its due diligence, but also tried to address the harms that it has identified. So I'm sorry, that's a very long answer, but I think we have the building blocks, is what I wanted to say. I've heard from everyone we can do this. It's not rocket science. We do these assessments. All we need to now do is put this into a framework that is, you know, comprehensive and transparent.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And I think you responded actually to a number of questions as well. I see there was some question from Jean-Paul and Emily and Tende about how we hold companies accountable when they generate harm and negative impacts and not apply best practices. And that actually is a good response to some of those questions. So thanks for that. Jamie, can I go over to you? Any highlights for you? Any lessons learned or things you want to emphasize that you heard from others?
I could be here for hours, to be honest. It was so rich so far. I don't know. I mean, I'm rebounding always on Catherine, and I really appreciate what Catherine's saying, and also what Rose said at the very beginning, in terms of it may be complex, but it's not complicated. And I dare say we've been saying these things for a number of years now, 10, 20, 30 years or thereabouts. And I'm looking at the report and hearing what everyone's saying. And the report, as one of its bottom lines says, the industry knows what is needed for prevention. So if that knowledge base is there, and I'm not talking from a lessons learned perspective in terms of future incidents, we have enough on our plate right now to say we know what works and we know what doesn't work. So why is it so difficult to get to let's make it work? And maybe I come from a bit of a jaded background, having worked in the humanitarian field for a number of years, having worked in international justice. By the time you get to the harm, it's too late because the harm has been done. Families have been destroyed, the environment's been degraded, whatever the harm is, it's too late in my mind. You can do reparation, you can manage grievance, but that individual has lost his or her life, that family has been destroyed. And so by then it's too late in the day, and no money is going to bring that individual back. And no remedial action is going to, I think, bring it back to a level of parity that we wanted before. So if there is that knowledge base, and if public commitment alone is insufficient, and if, as Rose said, malice is not there, then what is blocking? And I think that's what I would like to hear in terms of solutions. We can identify problems all day long. In my mind, there has to be that narrative shift and really get the right stakeholders around the table and say what actually works. Create that stigma for negative conduct and create a positive narrative and positive conduct change on the part of that courageous leadership. So it doesn't take one point. I think it's just more, trying to sort of bring a few elements together.
Yeah. Thanks, Jamie. And I think it's also, I think, a call from your side to say this is not the end of a discussion. This is really the starting point for the discussion on a continuation or a reinvigoration of the debate that, as Catherine mentioned, actually started 20 years ago. So hopefully this provides a bit of an impetus. Hélène, can I ask you to maybe later, but I think what we do is we ask for Gaurav's feedback, then go to the questions and answer, and then can I then circle back to you towards the end? Okay?
Okay.
Gaurav, any thoughts or ideas that you heard from the other panelists? You mentioned already a few. Any other additional points that you want to make before we go to the questions and answers?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Rohitesh just talked about, right? It's complex systems, and that's really what it is. It's I kind of echo what he's been saying. When I sit down and listen to meetings within our company, I don't hear things like "don't talk about it" or "let's not let this get out in the public" and things like that. But it's really from intent to implementation, and that's where the big challenge is. And when Glen talks about the mining company failing the mining workers, I mean, that really gets to anybody in the sector, right? I mean, we don't want to do that. And every attempt that we make is trying to get in a positive direction, but that the complexity and what do we do around that complexity to make sure that the right solutions are being picked and implemented, I think that's really where everything lies. And again, a simplistic answer, but it's one of those things that we have to grapple with on a daily basis. But I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Gaurav. Great. So it is 20 minutes before the hour, and we have another little video statement, and then a close. We have 15 minutes for questions, and there are some really good questions have come in. And I want to pick up on a group question, and raise your hand if you any of the panelists who wants to respond. It's combining a number of questions from Wagner, from Javier and Knox about third-party verification. So the question is, we heard about third-party verification in audits, ESG rating agency scores, responsible investment mechanisms, but all those mechanisms, are they functioning and are they meaningful? And do they actually incentivize good practice to prevent harm? Jamie, go for it.
I'll go for the security side, if I may only. I'll say at this stage, there are some levels of verification. In particular, we're looking at kind of management systems and ISO standards and in-house standards that entities may have. But in terms of third-party verification on the security side, there is very little out there. And even when we start considering looking at linking security indexes to the whole ESG reporting, because security and human rights will fall within the ESG, we've spoken to a number of entities who do the ratings on these issues, and they are woefully under-reporting and under-prepared, not understanding what security looks like and the risks towards human rights. So I would say, as a positive, we're at the beginning of this process. This is where I'm calling for that narrative shift. Bring in the clients to the table, saying, okay, now let's open up the doors a bit. Let's have this verification, and let's not be scared to have this discussion on what security could look like.
Thank you. Any other comments or any other panelists who want to take this question about third-party verification and to what extent they can be used to incentivize good practices?
I think, I think, first of all, they are very, very important part of the equation. And it really depends on how the company management ends up using the findings from a third-party verification, right? But it's important to remember that what we're dealing with is we're dealing with engineers and accountants and marketers, right? And human rights and environmental elements are new areas that are being learned on the job. And so what these verification systems do, or even the standards do, is help us quantify and frame these conversations in a manner that drives monitoring and performance improvement. So I think these are very, very important. They don't always show results in the same speed that I think our external stakeholders want and expect from us, but it's an important part of the equation for sure.
Thanks, Gaurav. Glen?
Yeah, I agree. There are independent third-party standards, and there are independent third-party audit standards. Which ones, in our view, would drive performance? Particularly incremental improvement, so to speak. And if it is linked, and how is it linked to the supply chain, essentially? So it is not a way, it's not a magic wand, it's just not the standard. It's what type of standard it is for us, the question, and that in itself, would be an approach that would take, around the standard well, what type of standard, how is it constituted? Is it an industry driven, what credibility does it bring to the table, and so on, so it's about transparency, it's about trust, it's about credibility, and it's about outcome, and that's, I think for us would be the response, really. Thanks.
Thanks, Glen. Then maybe just going through the list, maybe a specific question for Ro and one for Catherine. Question for Ro from Wagner. If risk doesn't mean harm, what does risk actually mean? And then one for Catherine from Tende is more about, can we really talk about zero harm when it comes to mining? What are acceptable levels of harm if we have to do mining?
Look, yeah, sure. As I see it, look, risk is the potential to cause harm. And risk is often situational. And the way that we do mining means that the situations in which people have the potential to be harmed are significant because of the nature of our activity. And that's what makes it incumbent on anybody involved in that activity, but particularly us as the operators, to make sure that the risk does not translate into harm. And we can approach that from many angles. You can approach it from a technocratic angle, which is about critical controls management and making sure that we have the right conditions in place so that risk does not translate to harm. We can approach it from a leadership point of view, as we've just been discussing. What type of leadership do you need to see at every level to manage risk in all its forms? And the fact that, as Gaurav was saying, that risk can often metastasize when the situation changes. So to have then the ability and the flexibility and dexterity to adjust our responses as risk evolves. And you can assess risk from the perspective of what we learn from past incidents when that risk occurred and whether the outcome was positive or negative. So look, the point I was trying to get across in my initial intervention, which this question touches on, is if we continue to try and drive risk down to zero, I don't think we'll ever succeed. That's why I'm pleased that the focus of this report is not to drive risk down to zero, because it recognizes that as long as there is mining, there is risk. And as long as we have a society like we have today, we have mining. But what we can absolutely try and do is to drive harm down to zero. So it takes you down two very different paths. The first path, if you try to drive risk down to zero, you would say no mining. That's not what we're saying here. What we're saying is it is possible to drive harm down to zero so that we can continue to mine but minimize harm.
Thanks, Ro. That's a good distinction. Thanks for that feedback. Catherine?
Yeah, I think the question was, is it possible to mine without causing harm? And I think Rose answered my question for me. Ro himself is saying you can't mine without risk, but you can mine without doing harm. Or as he later put it just now, we can try to drive harm down to zero. I love that approach. Let's drive harm down to zero. And for me, the question is not whether we should be doing that. I think it's obvious that we should. I think we all agree. I think the question is how. And I think for 20 years, we've not gotten it right. You know, we may have made some improvements temporarily here and there, as I think Hélène mentioned earlier, you know, at the same company, even with mine might be doing something right, whereas it's doing something very, very terribly wrong somewhere else, or even within the same project, maybe doing something right on the environmental side and something really terribly wrong on the human rights side. I think that we're at the point collectively now, and I've heard it in this panel, that we need to systematize the learnings and systematize the approach to driving harm down. And I think we can do it. I think there's legislation out there now that's being looked at in Europe. We have now draft legislation in Canada, but I also think we can't do it if we don't all get behind this. So it can't just be that the industry says we care about these things and we want these changes, but then pushes back or lobbies against the solutions that are being put on the table. So we need to get together. We need to work on this together.
Wonderful. Yeah, good. It's nice to see that things are kind of the way we have common ground in many of these aspects, and that we are trying to impact the various ways to get to that reduction of harm. Last question before, no, actually, probably there's a lot of other questions that come up in terms of what do we do in smaller with smaller companies, what can they do? And they have been noted. It's just we probably could have a number of hours going to the questions, but what I would like to do, since we have 10 minutes, is to give each of the panelists one round, maybe a minute, with some closing thoughts. And then we see a small video, kind of a statement that goes back to that point, Catherine, that you made about it's not rocket science. And that's Bruce Harvey's intervention. And then hand it over to Hélène for some closing comments. So can I invite each of you maybe to have 1 minute to kind of give a final closing statement. Glen, can I start with you?
From Catherine, let's keep working on it. We know what the problems are. Let's all try and work together to find the solutions, you know. And I think that's the message that came out of this session, and the goodwill, if you like, that came out of this session. And we are ready and willing, you know, to work with everybody towards the same objective. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Glen. Jamie, any last thought from your side?
It's plenty, but I think I'll simply maybe mention the question of the local communities. We've spoken a lot about the responsibility of companies, the protection of the personnel, and so on, and the environment. But certainly going forward, how we ensure that the local communities, be they independently or through civil society organizations, are at the table and are truly given a voice is one of the challenges still.
Thanks, Jamie. And I think that Bruce will speak to that as well, that you're absolutely right. And it also goes to a question about, I think there were some people in the chat on the Q&A box, they mentioned they lamented the fact that there's a lack of frank, informed and constructive dialogue between companies and communities. And yeah, we can have another workshop on that. And I think the Responsible Mining Foundation actually had some good platform discussions around that, but it's an ongoing issue, and I agree. Ro, any last parting points from you?
Look, just to end with where you started, which is that the topic was controversial in the way it was framed, but one benefit it had was to allow us to focus our efforts on these issues of harm and not get distracted by equally important conversations about benefit. That's a separate conversation. Because one thing I feel deeply passionate about, which has come through in this panel today, is that social and environmental harm cannot be offset by economic good. Let's not confuse the two. Totally different issues. We're here to talk about how to draw down social and economic harm all the way down to, and environmental harm all the way down to zero. And on another occasion, we can talk about how to drive economic benefit all the way to the top. So I really like that distinction in the way you set up the conversation.
Well, and it's great you use that distinction again, because I think mining companies are sometimes accused of only talking about, the positive ones. And indeed, there is no, when it comes to harm, there's no discussion about offsetting. It is about avoidance and prevention. So yeah, thanks for those words. Catherine, any last words from you?
Yeah, I just want to say that beyond driving harm down to zero and finding a way to do that, which I do believe is mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence systems, I also want to go back to something that one of the people in the video said, Richard from the London Mining Network, which is we're not just saying that we're going to continue mining as we are now, but try to do it better or do less harm. There also has to be recognition, and we've just had COP26, still ongoing. There has to be recognition that we also need to reduce material use in general. There has to be less mining, not just better mining, but also less mining. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the final thing I really want to say. And, if we don't do that, we're still going to be in trouble, because the planet is finite. And, there's no way that we can reduce harm down to zero fast enough to keep up with all the new mines that are being promoted, including now in the deep sea mining and expansion of mining. So that's my final statement. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Gaurav, last words from you.
Yeah, Luke, I think from a mining company standpoint, right, this is absolutely essential. This conversation is absolutely essential. And I know that we want to drive harm to zero for sure. Like I said in my earlier comment, the implementation is where we lack sometimes, but that's really an area for improvement, and how we systematize this, how we get the conversation going up and down our management hierarchies, how this will improve. I also want to say that these conversations are much needed on a regular basis, right? So, learning from others, both from the non-corporate sector as well as the corporate sector and the industrial associations. I think these conversations are extremely important. Getting more of our other management team members onto these platforms is going to drive this conversation forward. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Gaurav. That's a wonderful parting comments. So we have 5 minutes. What I'd like to do is we have one, and it goes back to Jamie's point about, and the point Catherine made earlier about rocket science. We have a very short statement from Bruce Harvey. Many of you probably know Bruce Harvey. I have a deep respect for Bruce. He is a practitioner, has been a senior mining executive for many, many years, is now a lecturer at the Business School of Otago in New Zealand. Adjunct professor at University of Queensland. Pierre, do you mind showing Bruce's wise insights?
Hello, everybody. I'm Bruce Harvey. I've been in the mining industry for over 40 years. I worked initially as a geologist. I've been a social performance specialist for 25, probably longer years. Look, the main thing I want to say today is mining does not have to be harmful. Managed well, minerals projects and operations can bring overall benefit. It comes down to 3 steps. The first step is to develop a good knowledge base from which to make informed decisions. The second step is to partner with affected community groups, with the relevant government people, and with competent specialists to design and execute the work that comes next when it comes to working with people and with local environments. And the third step is to undertake work that minimizes harm and maximizes benefit to directly affected people. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's just diligent, competent work.
That's Bruce Savinoan. It's not rocket science. Just do it. So on that note, I'd like to turn it over to Hélène. You've been very patient, Hélène, listening to everybody else. I'd like to ask you for your final thoughts and what do you see as the key takeaways from this discussion?
Wow, thank you to everyone. Really rich, and I just value the open conversations that we could have in this process of just seeing one another on the screen. So imagine how it will be when we manage to meet and bring people together in person. The things that stood out for me, Luke, are that we must remember to think about the entire industry. We're privileged to have influential mining voices on this panel, but the problem, if I may call it that, really is industry-wide, and there's lots of learning and sharing that needs to be done. And we have many requests from other parts of the world not represented here today, trying to transcend barriers, trying to transcend them and us in various forms, and asking for putting together, convening learning teams together to cross the boundaries that exist, east, west, north, south, and so on. And then lastly, the thing we haven't spoken about, because there's all this focus on companies, understandably, is the part of governments. Beside legislation, I really think that the big mining companies have immense lobbying power, and where they operate in this vast range of countries where they operate, they can do a lot to use the lobbying power to work with governments to strengthen prevention and to ensure respect for the rights of all stakeholders. Something also mentioned by Glen in terms of the ILO conventions and things like that. So there's huge lobbying power outside, not only doing their own work internally. And lastly, I'd like to also reference what Catherine said about this difference between materiality and salience, this broader scope in terms of where might the risks be. We know that many companies say to us, well, they're so busy, they only want to look at the material risks and the rest doesn't matter, doesn't apply to us. But we find that that sometimes obscures self-reflection, and maybe a broader assessment of what might be a risk will be more, allow for a broader understanding and allow for some self-reflection. And that one doesn't think, well, we're a certain nationality, so that doesn't apply to us, or whatever the difference might be. So we'd like to also say we're there to convene, to help bring these conversations forward, both privately and in public. And we really have many requests from groups around the world to make that happen. And back to you, Luke.
Thanks, Hélène, and yeah, thanks. It's also it seems that this is indeed a rich topic that deserve much more discussion, and well, hopefully we can do that in various forums around the world. This wraps up the webinar. I'm conscious of time. I want to thank. I hope that the participants and the panelists also, that we all shared some new insights, and that it is indeed the start of a discussion rather than the finalization of it or the end of it. I'd like to give a huge thanks to the panel for sharing your time, your insights, many gems. I definitely will watch the recording again to kind of really make sure I grasp everything. Also like to thank the Responsible Mining Foundation for putting this together. Not only you, Hélène, but also Pierre and Jennifer, who have been tirelessly working in the background today, but also in putting the reports together. Also, thanks to the translators. We haven't heard them, but many of you will have heard them, and we probably sometimes speak a little bit fast, so thanks for that. Thanks to you, it will be available to a much wider audience. And then lastly, huge thanks for everybody who dialed in and made time available today to attend the meeting. Apologies if we didn't come to all your questions, but we hope you got something out of it. And for now, have a good day, and hopefully to next time. Thanks for now.
Thanks to our moderator.